Okay, so does somebody want to cut the crowd noise and close the door, please? Hmm? Oh, okay. I can't talk well. So, welcome to the Jose Working Group. Hopefully this is the last time we see all of you people as the Jose Working Group. I'd love to become an ex-chair. As opposed to being a chair? Oh, but my AD would never do that to me. No. So, standard no well applies to this meeting. The information which you would normally find on our charter page is here. Document statuses. So all of the documents which are actually in our purview to have been written. They have all gone to the RSC editor. There are currently 2 drafts which are in the edit state, and all of the rest of the drafts are actually in the rest state, waiting for those 2 drafts to get finished. So, with any luck, we'll actually be able to get into Auth 48 and out of Auth 48 by, if not the middle of April, the end of April. The agenda. We'll finish the administrative stuff. We'll talk about the 2 documents which we have, which are doing COSI. We'll have some discussion about COSI after that. And then as time permits, we will have a presentation from Mike about his key managed signatures, and potentially talk a little bit. The one thing that's currently hot on the list is people still want to have some form of clear message signatures, and we'll see if there's anybody who thinks that they really need to do that or not. And I'm not expecting to see any activity. The one issue that we currently have on the thumb draft document, or the thumbprint document, which was requested for input during last call, but we didn't actually receive any from anybody, is the thumbprint draft is currently on standards track. Given that it's no longer actually defining any things which are going to be actively and immediately used, such as header parameters, but just defines an algorithm for how to do something, there is a question of should we move it down from standards track to informational track. So if anybody wants to express an opinion on that, we'd love to hear it. Yes, the word must does appear in the document. Huh?
Joe Hildebrand. Check. I don't know, is Mike on?
Yes.
All right. Is the implication that if it has the word must in it, that it has to be on standards track and not informational track?
Carrie Lynn, no, not necessarily, but if this is required anywhere, then it just seems like it should potentially be on a standards track. I mean, I'm new here, so I'm just
Yeah.
Matt Miller. You know, there being 2119 language in this doesn't necessarily bother me. It's if you're going to do this, then one must do this is fine with me. And as far as the document itself, I thought I had sent something to us, but I'm fine with information.
Informational.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I know of one other standards document in another body that would take a normative reference to it, should we finish it. I don't think either status would prevent that from happening. I'm more curious what the standard IETF practice is for just making this decision, and I'm fine either way. Just follow what we would normally do.
We're doing it right now. Okay, so we'll take the input that we have received. If anyone else wants to give us additional input, we'll take that under advisement. And as soon as we get it pushed up to the AD, we will have a decision as part of that process.
Perhaps I should.
Is that on? Okay.
Yes.
I had to figure out whether it was a slide switch or a rocker switch. Okay. So we'll now have a presentation about two documents that have been presented as potential candidates for COSI, and then we'll talk about what should happen with COSI. Next. So what we're looking at is the two specifications we have basically said there's a large parts of the Jose world that we want to keep, but there are some things that we're willing to say are going to change. The first and biggest is, of course, we're not going to be cryptographically compatible. So we're going to make changes so that you will not be able to transform a document from a Jose document to a COSI document or back again. We obviously want to use CBOR idioms rather than rather than JSON idioms whenever possible. So we can lose some of the things like base64 encoding because we have natively binary encodings. We'll probably do a bit of changes in terms of naming things so that we can save a whole lot of space if we use integers where strings are used in places. There are going to be some places where we'll keep strings, some places where we'll probably swap strings to be integers, just because it compresses everything down. There are, however, things that we will want to reuse. We're going to basically use the same algorithm registry. We may add some algorithms to that registry. In fact, we almost certainly will add some algorithms to that registry. But we're actually going to keep the same algorithms structure where we can. We're going to keep the header parameter registry. So basically, the things that we get defined into COSI for things like core will actually be available for anyone who's using Jose stuff as well. For example, it's quite possible that the sequence number which they're talking about having for replay will be useful in some various algorithms that are various places that are currently using Jose for some reason, various reasons. And we're also going to try to keep some of the basic paradigms. So, in terms of how you structure things, that's going to tend to stay pretty much similar. Next. So Karsten produced a document which is out there. And he basically took the simplistic approach. That is, we're going to keep almost all of the structure that is currently there in Jose, and just replace it with CBOR. So basically you start by, any place where you have binary data, you actually use a binary encoding, you don't use base64 encoding. We obviously use CBOR rather than JSON for actually doing the encoding. We use integers for map names in a large number of places, but not necessarily everywhere. And we're encoding using maps and arrays in places where we might use periods. His original document actually continued to use maps, but it's easy enough to change it into using periods in a lot of places, arrays in a lot of places.
Joe Hildebrand. So for people who haven't done much CBOR, it's useful to explain this whole integers as map names thing. So in JSON, the keys in the key value pair are always strings. In CBOR, basically any type can be on that left-hand side. And there's this sort of emerging kind of sort of approach in the CBOR world that if you've got a small number of keys that are well enumerated, you can instead use small integers that take up a single byte in their encoding. And you can use both negative integers and positive integers for that. And if they're less than 23, so you get sort of 46-ish of these things, plus or minus one, then you've got a good number of keys that basically you can put into a registry of some kind, and you can, in the same map, also use strings as keys. So it allows you to do extensions without having to register them. So the sort of the cool way of doing it is you register all the ones you think you're going to use, and then allow people to use strings for whatever else they want to use. We could decide whether that was an approach we wanted to use here or not, but that seems to have worked, at least conceptually, in some other protocols.
And even if you overflow that small 46 number of things, you go up to 256 bytes, you're basically still looking at using 2 bytes for that. So I mean that's the same as using 1 character. Okay. So this is what an encoding looks like using the diagnostic dump. That's much easier to read than using the hex dump, even though I'm sure there's way too much information in there for anyone to actually want to read. Pick up the slides later if you're actually interested. This is actually an encoding of, it must be 2 signatures. Okay. So the document that I wrote uses a lot of the same approach. We're using CBOR, we're using binary at base 64. I've actually went ahead and replaced several of the maps with arrays. So we keep maps for headers, but we use arrays for all the external structures for what the signature is, what the signature data is, recipient structure, the encrypted structure. I actually, because I'm a firm believer in it, separated signatures and MACs. I don't believe they're the same thing. Plus, for MACs, we want to actually be able to do recipient stuff so we can actually do key management with it. I did that long before the draft came out that Mike did for key management with JWS. And I'd actually reused the exact same structure for the encrypted body and for recipients. So the same code deals with both of them, which actually potentially saves some code there. Next. And so this is basically what the exact same example I had up there before looks like with the CBOR diagnostic dump. And you really aren't going to see that many things. There's some extra nulls in there and some places where curly braces turned into square brackets. I'm not actually going to go through the structure of what my stuff looks like. It's in the slides. It's also in the draft. So we're now going to go on and look at some of the design decisions that I made that I felt were actually very reasonable to do. So I start by basically looking at size comparisons. So this is basically, I went ahead and applied the, use integers rather than strings to the draft that Karsten produced. And this is basically if you have, one signer, one MAC, one encryption. So these are 3 different messages. They're basically minimal messages. So, for example, the MAC does the signer only has unprotected headers. It doesn't have unprotected and protected headers. The sizes would be the same whether you had unprotected headers or protected headers in terms of both Karsten and my encoding. If you added other fields, that the sizes would go up and down, and they wouldn't actually happen to just come out basically the same sizes all the time. This does not include things like IVs. This is basically just the overhead of encoding the basic structure.
Justin Richard, for the Jose column, is this for the compact encodings or the JSON encodings or the flattened JSON encodings?
This is the JSON encodings.
Okay, so it's the big one. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Next. Okay, so basically, I did analysis of what's the cost differential on doing maps versus arrays. And this is, again, assuming you're using integer indexed maps. So if you're doing an array, it costs you a byte to have a null in some place that you're not doing you're not using that field. So if you don't have authenticated header fields, then it costs you a byte to have a null in there because you still have to keep the element filled in the array. On the other hand, a map costs you an extra byte for things that you do have. So if you have both authenticated and unauthenticated header fields, it costs you an extra byte over just having one of them.
So from Ludwig's sites, can you provide more detail on the size comparisons, perhaps some document? Maybe you could send that to the list. Maybe.
Yeah, I've got a text file I can send off to the list that is totally unreadable.
Ludwig, does that help? Would that be enough for now? The list will be fine.
Okay. Yeah, because otherwise I need to annotate it so that people could actually understand what is there. It's what's there basically. It was enough for me to figure out what was going on and not much more. So if you look at the body of a signature, there are 4 fields that are in the body of a signature, basically. You always have 2 of them filled. You'll always have basically the assumption, I was not doing detached content. So you'd always have a content, you'd always have some header fields in the signature. With a signature item, there are 3 items, there's always 2 of them filled. So basically that can gives you an idea. In the signature body, it doesn't really matter whether you have an array or a map. It's going to come out about the same both ways, depending on whether you decide to fill those extra fields. Signature item, it's a little bit cheaper probably to have the array rather than the map, because you're always going to be paying that 1 extra byte for having the map or for having an array, but you're paying 2 extra bytes in terms of that for the item. Similarly, I've got the analysis up here for an encrypted body, the recipient, and basically the recipient structures in terms of what you're transmitting on the wire for doing an arrays is the only real big loser. On the other hand, it's quite possible that we'll look at it and say the fact that you're using basically identical code for doing the recipient body and the recipient structure, the encrypted body and the encrypted structures, gives you enough of a code savings on the chip that you're willing to pay that additional wire cost. Okay. Using integers for strings. obviously it's a big win on the left-hand side of the map. But it's possible we could actually do some of the same substitution on the right-hand side of the map. So we could assign integers for algorithm names. Big win. The one issue that comes up that we're going to potentially have to deal with in some way is implementations may have to be able to deal with having either the string value or the integer value there. So it's like, I know I can always send the integer value, but I may receive the string value because I'm receiving it from someone who doesn't produce that yet. Because they rolled it out before we assign, they rolled the string out before we assign them the number. It may actually be in that case you have to send them the string. I don't know. So that's actually something we need to think about in terms of as we move forward and we add new extension things and we assign numbers to them, what happens in terms of do we actually assign numbers? How soon, how quickly do we need to assign numbers? Do we need to set up an early number assignment process so that we don't get the strings rolled out instead of the integers? Next. One of the things that I did in the array structure is I went ahead and assigned an element in the base array to say this is what the type of the structure is. I did not try to do any sort of fancy, I'm going to infer the type based upon something else. Carsten suggested that we could potentially actually assign some CBOR tags to identify what the structure types are. Looking at it, I think that it's actually a wash in terms of size, because I've got 1 byte for inside the array to say this is what the type of the structure is, or I've got 1 byte outside the array which says this is the tag for that type of structure. So it's not. Obviously, you don't need that if you stick with the mapping version, because you can use a similar sort of analysis that's currently done for Jose to say whether something is a signature or an encrypted thing.
So the tags are most useful if these structures actually might mix with some other structures in some place. So you would have the tag right on the outside and would be able to find out, is this even considered as, or is it something completely different?
Yes.
Joe Hildebrand. So I would suggest that when we go down this path that we figure out what the subset of CBOR that we're going to be using is. So for example, we might not need floats for this work, in which case the thing that I'm using to parse this doesn't need to include all the float parsing. Yeah, so it saves 100 bytes, which is nice. And I also probably wouldn't want to do the streaming bits, for example. And the next thing that's right on the lip of that would be tags for me. And what I found with tags so far is that they're useful when I want to create a particular data type on receiving. So I want to tag the thing as a date so that I create a date object instead of creating a string object. We may or may not have any of that where that sort of syntax level of creating the right object is as important to us. We may know all the types ahead of time.
Right.
If that's the case, then we don't need the tags necessarily.
Right. And one of the questions on that basically becomes, is this always going to be a top-level object, or are they going to get embedded into something?
Mm-hmm.
So that, for example, if you do, an encrypted thing which is also a signed thing, it could become very useful when you look at the payload at that point to say this is what it is, as opposed to having to figure out what the payload is from something else.
Derek Atkins. In my use case, it's definitely going to be embedded and nested.
Okay. The ACE stuff today that they were talking about was always top level, and they always knew what it was from external signals.
Matt Miller, For at least my uses of Jose today, I've known ahead of time what I'm dealing with. So for me, it doesn't matter. But if it's important for others, then we ought to keep them.
Joe Hildebrand again. I have no opposition to having tags, and as I mentioned, tags for me are right on the line that I could be argued either way on. So if there's a good reason to do it, I'm all for it. If there's not, we probably save 10 bytes in the implementation or something. It doesn't save that much, but it's a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So I separated the max structure and the signature structures, as I said. It's easier to discuss the security properties of what you're doing if max and signatures aren't put in the same pot. And it's quite likely in the IoT world that they're not going to be doing signatures anyway. They're actually going to be doing max almost all the time. Because they want something small that they can send across the wire.
I wouldn't go that far. I don't think that I don't think that's true. Ideally, we would like to go to asymmetric crypto, but it may not be possible in all cases.
Right. I mean, obviously, especially if you want to do end-to-end stuff, you kind of have to do signatures rather than just max.
Yeah. So in any case, please support those.
Oh, well, I mean, no. I mean. The implementation will support both, but if you, in point of fact, separate the two of them, then that allows you to say, we just can basically not include any of the signature stuff and in onto this library. And if we're doing encryption, then half the max stuff is already included anyway, because the recipients, the structure for managing your keys for the max structure and for encryption structure is they're identical. They're exactly the same thing. Next. So the single encryption structure. It simplifies code, and part of what I'm hearing for about a third of the IoT people is we don't have enough space to do anything. A third of them we have enough space to do a small amount of things, and a third of them is well, we got lots of space. We can do just about anything. It depends on which people you're talking to and what day it is. Again, by doing it, we basically can do AEAD key wrap algorithms, which may be useful in terms of enforcing some things down the line in terms of things like this is actually the name of the algorithm we're doing. Mike?
Mike Jones, just a clarification question. I think I know what you mean, but is it the case that by this you mean that you're folding the initialization vector value and the encrypted data value into a single value like TLS does and things for AEAD algorithms?
No, that's someplace else. But
okay, then what is this?
One of the other thing that it allows for is at some point in the future we can move from the composite algorithm set to a Chinese menu algorithm set. It's not clear that that's a good idea, but the ability to do so at some point in the future is something I don't necessarily want to preclude. So basically we can talk about what the algorithm is at the encrypted message layer. We can talk about what the algorithm is at the key wrap layer, and then if you wanted to, you could add another layer on top of that, which is this is the algorithm that we're using to get a key to get to the key wrap key. It's a very, very low priority thing as far as I'm concerned, and right now I think we should probably stay with the composite algorithm world, but if things start to go haywire in terms of registration, we can revisit that decision at that point in time. Okay, I did move the tag into the crypto text. I haven't moved the IV into the text, into the ciphertext. It is potentially something we want to think about, especially for some algorithms. I know that the people who presented in ACE today, we're basically talking about one of the things that they want to do is use implicit nonces, implicit IVs with CCM so that they don't have to transport an explicit IV. And the question at that point is, do you signal that by just having an empty IV field, or do you signal that by, we're going to roll the IV into the ciphertext stream, and the algorithm is just going to know whether it starts with an IV or not? That's, part of the question is, for example, are there two different communities who are using the CCM code, one who wants IVs and one who doesn't want IVs? And I don't think we know an answer to that question at this point in time. When we did the analysis on which way we should go for Jose, it wasn't really clear that one version was preferred over the other version in terms of the libraries that are there. And since basically a lot of the times we're going to be rolling into new or existing code, it's going to be whatever they want to do anyways. It's probably not going to make a whole lot of difference. It's not that hard to strip to strip the tag off the back and feed it in separately if you need to, because you know how long it is. You pushed a button. Yeah, don't touch the mouse. The bad part is the mouse covers a whole lot more space than just the pad. One of the things I did, which is a cleanness of design, as opposed to something that potentially really needs to be done, is I basically separated out unauthenticated and authenticated attributes and put them in a lot more places. So since we're using the same structure for the base encrypted message and for recipients, obviously I get both the whole for authenticated and unauthenticated attributes for free at that point. For signatures, basically there were just unauthenticated attributes associated with the payload, and authenticated attributes are associated with the signature. So I basically have split it down so that I have authenticated and unauthenticated attributes with the payload, authenticated and unauthenticated attributes with the signature, and basically have made a statement that the attributes at that layer only apply to that layer.
Clarification question.
Yeah.
By attributes, do you mean header parameters?
Header parameters, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I still tend to live way back in the CMS world where they were, yeah. For MAC and encryption, obviously each layer is, the authentication is done on each layer. So that what you have at a recipient structure, you would have an AEAD algorithm. What you have at the message structure, you have an AEAD algorithm. They're doing themselves separately. Similarly, on the MAC, the MAC value computed applies to just what's in the MAC message layer with the payload. If you had authenticated attributes in the recipient, that would be authenticated by the key wrap algorithm that you would be using at that layer. Changes. Okay, I already talked about. We have had a request to have AES CCM-8. I actually had to look up and figure out what the 8 meant, because CCM actually has 2 parameters. They say that they want an HP, an implicit IV in many cases, so they don't have to transport it. There was some interesting HIP work that was done by Bob Moskowitz about 4 years ago. Huh? What is HIP? Thank you. Host Identity Protocol. Which basically he was trying to figure out how to do everything with as few cryptographic primitives as possible. And he got to the point where it's like he had AES only in encrypt mode. Well, if you do GCM, CCM, you're fine on that because that's all you need because you're doing counter plus CBC. He tried to get a mode of doing HMAX or key derivation, and that's where he got hung up. Is doing a KDF function with just an AES encrypt operation. It turns out if you have a good random key to start with, you're fine. If you have a bad random key to start with, you can't really use an AES to do that. You really need some sort of hash function there rather than a MAC function to do that initial compression of the not quite so random data into random data. And of course, we're kind of assuming that you would also additionally potentially have an elliptic curve if you wanted to do something more than a shared secret key management technique, because it's just smaller on the wire. So, now we go back to being a chair. Now we have some interesting discussion questions. So the first question is, how many people are actually interested in working on this? I mean people who will review the documents, comment on the documents, implement documents. Depending on the approach, I'm intending to edit the document, but I'm planning to do it on GitHub so people can make pull requests if they want to actually help edit the document as well. So, people who are interested in working on this, seeing this work done. Oh, sorry. People who are interested in actually working on this document and contributing in some form. Okay. People who are willing to read whichever approach document we use and put comments on the list, assuming it will. Well, for now we'll say the Jose list, by Easter. You got the plane flight home.
No, they need a little more time than that.
Huh?
But that's in a week.
Yes, that's in a week.
Yeah, no. We need a little bit more reasonable deadline than that.
I'm looking at how many people are really eager to get work done, as opposed to just I want to get work done. It was just kind of curious. We've got two approaches. We've got Carson's document and we've got my document. Both of them are probably reasonable starting places. My document has quite a bit more changes from the Jose document than what Carson's does. And I don't know how much of that people actually have stomach for. So let's discuss which document you think is probably a better starting point.
Wait a second. I'm sorry, I misquoted the last question. So, well,
Be my guest.
I'm not even sure it belongs in Jose. I'm Kathleen Moriarty, AD. So it's not in your charter. This is of interest.
That's the next question. I'm perfectly willing to flip them. That's fine.
Yeah, so it's not in the charter. Even just this week, and we're only on Tuesday, I've been in two different sessions where this would be of interest. One was RADX, and the other was ACE. ACE even came up with a generalized thing because this wasn't ready yet, but the working group didn't adopt it. And I think if it was done outside of the working group, that actually could make a difference for them, because then they could reference this cozy method implementation, whatever you want to call it, and just incorporate that in the draft that they were talking about. I think it would be important to split it out because these other groups are interested, and I don't know that people will notice that the work is being done in Jose, right? I think it's different enough that with the IoT focus on it, doing a short working group to stand up to get this done and get the right attention on it, so the ACE people get in the room that are interested, so RADX folks get in the room that are interested, and they have applications that could be using this on GSMA and other things. So I don't know, I think it might be important enough to split it out, but if that happens, I'd want to see it done very quickly, and I think I'd like to get the sense of, you know, can we do that and get the momentum to do that with a new charter as opposed to amending this one even before the next meeting, because people need this now.
Okay, don't go away. Don't go away. Stay put.
So,
She's not going anywhere.
Joe?
So,
Joe?
so I have a couple questions on that in terms of how fast we can spin things up. So, if you ask for it, we can have a new mailing list tomorrow.
Yes.
If we bring up a mailing list and start charter discussions and do this in parallel, is that acceptable?
I would like you to start that right away. And even when I was sitting listening to this, this entire presentation, you have different design decisions from Jose. Making some of those and the requirements clear, Hannes had raised some particular requirements in your new charter for COSI would make a lot of sense. And, you know, you're obviously an author of a document, so you being the chair wouldn't be a good thing. So, you know, this switch, I think, would be good for lots of different reasons, and there's probably more that I'm not even mentioning. But yeah, I don't see a problem if the energy is there. You get a charter done with having one ready for Prague, especially with the emphasis from ACE. Like, in the room, ACE, a lot of the folks said, I'm in the room because I need to see this done, and they're really interested in the space. And they're following along, and not everybody's contributing, but they need all these problems for IoT solved, and this is going to help them, right? So if they can reference something that folks with the clue on how to do CBOR and implement this, that they can point to, I think it's going to make a difference. So yeah, I would help you.
Okay. So basically, I mean, in terms of process, as long as we don't say we want to do this work in the Jose working group, we would need a new mailing list in either case. So we can spin that up quickly. And then it's just a question of whether we spend the time writing a charter and creating a working group, which is not necessarily bad.
Joe?
Joe Hildebrand. I think Kathleen's on the right track there as far as I'm concerned. I would like to have a very frank discussion about what the new charter ought to be. I mean, we'd have to do that in a rechartering exercise. Doing that in a separate group would allow us to finish off the little bits and bobs we've got here, have a, yes, soon, but to have a separate list for the new stuff so we don't sort of have to intermix them terribly much. I like the idea of making sure that people can find it, and the fanfare of a new working group is one of the ways to get a little bit of extra attention. I think particularly with the support from the area director directly, as we have here, without having to go through the whole sort of BOF cycle necessarily, I assume.
Yeah, I think there's enough to avoid the BOF cycle.
Okay, good.
Well, and I think there's enough demand and enough request for speed. Avoiding the BOF cycle is good.
So I think that the actual overhead associated with splitting out a new working group is relatively small here. It's all work that we were going to have to do anyway, and we get some upside from it, so I'd say let's just go ahead and do that.
Okay. Bill?
Bill Hornbaker, you know, the fact that you are now having to spin up a new working group to change the format of the encoding, I think really speaks to an architectural problem. When JSON came onto the scene, the reason I was very keen on it was I wanted to standardize on one data model across all of the things I wanted to do. And now I've just been watching this, and I did make comments when CBOR was being discussed. I said that I thought it was the wrong approach. I was told, no, this is a private discussion, it's not a standards issue, go away, we don't have to talk to you. You shut the door in my face, You didn't want to talk to me, and now, because you didn't use the JSON data model, we're now having to write drafts to explain how to do this thing we've already standardized in a different encoding. And before we start to do working groups and a whole new work cycle to talk about how we do X in Y, I think we should re-examine and see, are there other ways that we could get the same level of compression, the same level of compactness, without introducing a whole new data model and a whole new way of doing things.
Are you going to answer that or ask me a question? So if you have proposals, I would get those in right away. Jose is close to being done with their charter. So if it's something that fits in the charter and you think you can fix some of these things and you can make it within JSON work, then I ask you, has it's been submitted?
Well, it's a JSON issue. I made an alternative proposal to doing encoding if you wanted a compact encoding. And
There are remote people.
Yeah, please, microphone.
Please use the microphone. There's remote people, and they are contributing and participating.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I've got a technical proposal, and I suggest that what we do is to see whether doing it in CBOR and doing it in the stuff that I've already proposed, which one gets it more compact. I know that you're not going to need to spin up a new working group for mine.
Okay, get it in, and we'll see what it is, but we won't delay at least chatting on a list. A list can open, a list can close.
Can you do me a favor and post the name of the draft to Jabber?
Joe Hildebrand.
Well, either that or to me, one of the two.
So one of the proposals is a relatively straight porting with no semantic changes and might not require a new working group depending upon how we approached it. One of the things that the people who've done a little bit of CBOR are saying, I believe, is that a slightly more idiomatic use of CBOR will have benefits in terms of the size of the code needed to parse it and the size on the wire, etc. So those changes into the idioms of the syntax, the target syntax, are the things that probably sort of move this, for me anyway, into being a little more CBOR specific and making sure we've got those people in the room, etc. So that's, for me, I don't see that as an architecture issue necessarily with Jose. I see this as an issue with trying to do the best CBOR that we can for the target audience.
Mike Jones, I've read both drafts in detail. I think there's great things to take from both of them. I like that Karsten did basically a literal re-encoding. I like that Jim substituted arrays for maps in places where that made sense. I'll note that in some sense that's what we did with the compact encodings. We had arrays where the array delimiters were actually periods rather than using JSON. So if I had a preference, I would start with Karsten's draft but applying the array changes. At a meta level, I do think it's, and Joe and I had talked about this and Karsten, that it's pretty critical if this is going to happen fast, that we have the meta discussion about what kinds of changes to Jose do we want to entertain and decide them up front, rather than sort of relitigating every decision throughout the process. If we do that, we could end up 3-4 years like we have here, and I think that's not what anybody wants.
Matt Miller. I agree that I think we need to, be very upfront and very quick and very concise on what our requirements are. I do have a personal preference that we unify our key management model, but it would be good to have this stuff done quickly. However, I don't want us to be rushing to get something done and then have to come back later and fix it.
So, look,
Just because
Go
I was
ahead.
in line anyway, Martin Thompson. The question of things like the transformation that Mike was talking about, it's probably the sorts of things that I would rather this sort of effort focus on, rather than, you know, people's wishes and dreams about what Jose could have been, unfortunately. There are some concerns with moving to an array-based thing as opposed to a map, and there are advantages in either direction, and extensibility and various trade-offs that need to be made. Then we can get into questions of whether or not you use numbers rather than strings in various other places to save space, and how you manage that, and that's an interesting discussion to have as well. But I think those are the discussions you want to have. Otherwise, yeah, years will pass. And some people actually want to use this.
okay. So,
This may be too low level, Mike, again, but I do hear people in some contexts still wanting detached payloads.
In fact, that was actually presented at ACE today.
Yes.
I mean, he was detaching payloads. I mean, and obviously it's doable with either method.
I was just seeing where we were.
Yeah,
So
this is-
it is 6:22 at this point, so we have 8 minutes
Okay.
left. So I don't think we really want to discuss in detail missing features or controversial features.
Okay. Kathleen, do we want to nominate somebody to take initial cut at a charter, or a small set of people to do an initial cut at a charter?
Nominate, or people, do they want to volunteer? And, you know, we're going in a couple of
Yeah.
tracks here, right? So from Martin and Phil, there are some things in Jose that maybe they think get fixed. So if they want to do proposals, that's one separate thing. That's Jose, and then, yeah.
Well,
folks
I mean,
wanna work on charter.
obviously,
So-
we're going to go to the list for full discussion. It's
So
just,
d-
an initial cut is always looking at this in terms of what
Yeah.
sorts of things we
I
want. to put in.
just had to divide those
Yeah.
things, that there's two tracks going on here.
So just to clarify, the people that want to make changes and think this can be done in Jose, start the discussion on the Jose list. We're still opening up a Jose list to discuss potential charter, separate list.
Yes, cozy.
Cozy.
Unless there's objections to that. I heard, two folks saying we could do this here, and most people are supporting. I mean, and we can open up a list and close it, right? So I think doing this in the cozy list would be good.
All right, so can I see a show of hands of people who are willing to start charter discussions on a cozy list? Okay. So I think the conclusion of this conversation then is people that have proposals that need to go to Jose need to get those in very soon. And as soon as the cozy list is up, it'll be announced. And is there one or two people that want to do a first cut at a charter?
I'll do that with you if it's this week.
I'm willing to host the meeting next week where we, after you guys have got a strong answer.
Okay.
Okay, but you get it in and then we'll talk about it and we won't make it.
All right. Okay. So,
Do you want to be in on this? Not you, John. Do you think you have enough? I can't remember your name. Next to Kathleen. Yes. Do you have enough things that you think you want to see in it that you want to help do that initial charter cut?
So, Göran Selander, I presented the object security drafts
I know.
today. Yeah, okay. for others to know. So, I mean, we basically have a set of use cases where we think this is interesting, and we got a good reception at ACE today. But there is also discussion about how it fits into the co-op architecture. I mean, the extreme pressing deadline, which I hear is. We don't need it tomorrow, but we'd like to not end up in a couple of years ahead.
Right.
But there are certain scenarios we'd like to contribute to this as input in sort of sizes, mainly of.
The only reason I suggested one or two people to start a charter.
Yeah, no, I understand. I was trying to get somebody who wasn't Jose.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, Caponi, ACE co-chair. So I'm willing to provide an initial proposal to the COSE charter.
Okay. If you want to help with the initial cut, let's gather up here afterwards.
Right.
So I suspect, Hannes, I suspect this from the discussion that we had to be useful in two places. One was in the solution that Gern presented on sort of end-to-end security when you have a client talking to some resource server to get some data. But the other place where this could be useful is in the context of something where the authorization server passes encodes some information and wants to have a compact encoding. This is not data, obviously. It's, we're talking about authorization information, keys, and etc. Their key transport mechanism. And in that case, and that would be, I think, a fairly integral part of the solution, because in ACE, because that's what all of the proposals would definitely need. And currently, you can either cook up something on your own, or use the JWT or similar JWK, etc. mechanism. But ideally, it would be good to have this sort of more compact version if available.
Lionel Moron, so DIME Working Group Chair. So there is also some ongoing discussion regarding the need for end-to-end end-to-end security. And for the time being, there is only service requirements or security requirements. But I think that at the next meeting, we will start speaking about solution. At the initial time, it was about reusing JSON for that. So I think that we'll be also interested by this work.
Okay, thank you. All right, so
I'm assuming you're not asking.
we have we have one item on the list for as time permits, but Mike, we only have about 2 minutes, so I don't know. Do you want to just? I guess okay.
I'll just say there's a PowerPoint, or actually a PDF, which is now in the meeting materials. I encourage people to read it. I'm not going to go through it. Actually go to the next to last slide. Part of why I did this was to try that one, to try to think about what lessons we might take from the Jose exercise that we might pull into the Jose exercise should we do it. And one of them that I agree with Jim on is that if we were not to have overloaded ALG in the way we did, some of the structures would be cleaner and you'd get more code reuse. I have no problem with that. And that was the lesson. There's a completely separate question, which is whether people are interested in a way they weren't before in having key management for Macs. And I really don't have an opinion in that. I just wanted to get down for the record while we still had a working group, how I would reuse stuff were we to decide to do that. And I'm not presupposing a decision. That's probably a good list question, and I don't have an opinion.
Okay, so if everybody could read Mike's draft and take a look at his slides and post any comments to the mailing list, that would be helpful. Anything else from the floor? With 1 minute to spare.
Yeah, there's an Acme BOF that's And one of the things that's happening is we're starting to use JSON and Jose possibly in applications. And so we're starting to find issues when we're trying to apply it. One of the things we'd quite like is a direct encoding, a direct serialization that doesn't involve base 64. Because if I'm reading through a draft, I do not want to be reading examples that are base 64 encoded of what I want to look at. So I have written a draft. It's out there, Hallam Baker, JSON, unencoded. It's only a page of actual meat, but the question will be whether we'd want to do it in Jose or possibly in Acme or somewhere else if Jose closes.
Can you send a link to that to the mailing list, please? Mike?
I was actually just going to support Phil in the sense that I do hear people coming up to me saying, I have a payload that I have a way to transmit without it changing. How can I do a sign without doing the base 64? I think there could be a one-page draft that we could do that would do that as an extension, even though we chose not to do that before. And I think we should at least have that discussion on the list before we close the group. It's definitely a Jose extension. It's not a different thing.
Okay. Again, anything like that needs to get onto the list shortly before. 5 minutes ago. All right, so at 6:31, anything else? If you haven't signed the blue sheet, please come up and do so at the front of the room. Thank you very much. I think this is the first warm room I've been in all week.
Great.